Memory politics signifies the public activity carried out by different groups who are promoting specific and often very divergent interpretations of a kind of collective past. And so memory politics has to do with and centers on how to commemorate that past, what kinds of statues, what kinds of museums, what kinds of memorials. Also, it very much explodes around issues of how to teach that past in schools. There's also, much debate around how to enshrine various components of that past in law. So those are kind of the things that, in my mind, when I think about memory politics, those are kinds of the issues that come up. So memory politics are where history and politics collide in our society. And because all of this takes place in the public sphere, not just in the ivory tower, because it's happening in public, and because many of these issues go to like the core elements of our identities, of who we are, who we believe ourselves to be, things can get very heated. And these issues therefore become things that, a lot of people want to weigh in on and have ideas about, not simply, those who study it, but those who just sort of live in our society. So the politics of memory is not surprisingly tightly connected to issues of democracy and social inclusion, and also very tightly connected to their opposites. So very tightly connected to challenges to democracy and to social exclusion. And what that connection looks like varies dependent on where memory politics are playing out. So be that in a democratic state, or be that under an authoritarian or totalitarian regime. So in democracies, ideally, memory politics play out in the form of discussion and debates about whose past matters and which pasts are going to be honored and remembered. So today in our democracies, these debates have become increasingly angry and ferocious and fractious. But again, ideally in democracies, the process of debating memory politics would lead to sort of like an addition of perspectives. It would lead to a widening, an expansion of points of view. So it would lead to, again, ideally speaking, it would lead to the coexistence of multiple historical interpretations. I should make a little footnote here. I am an academic after all. So by multiple historical, interpretations, I only mean interpretations grounded in evidence. I clearly am not suggesting that, denying the Holocaust is a fruitful contribution to democratic debate. So if we can have multiple historical interpretations that are grounded in evidence, that process of memory politics can, I think, be very, very useful within the confines of a democracy. So ultimately, in a functioning democracy, memory politics can actually, I think, further reconciliation. So I think there can be this really sort of positive outcome of memory politics. By contrast, of course, under authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, and it should be noted within populist movements in still functioning democracies today, the emphasis is on silencing, on erasing, on omitting. So the goal in authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, and again for some populist movements, is the creation of a single narrative. And the way a single narrative can be achieved is by excluding, by denigrating, and then obliterating any competing narratives. And then the next part of that process is not just to sort of deny and silence, but to actually call those competing narratives unpatriotic or even traitorous. So when I think about that, I think about the past. As a historian, I think here, for example, of how the Nazis in the 1930s upheld the stab in the back legend. And the stab in the back legend said that Germany had not lost the First World War on the battlefield. The defeat only occurred because brave German soldiers were stabbed in the back by allegedly scheming communists and socialists and Jews and supposed profiteers and pacifists. Civilians had stabbed brave German soldiers in the back. So, back in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, to actually suggest that Germany had lost the war militarily, which is the truth, that was not acceptable in the Third Reich. Because the enemy in these authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, and again, in certain populist movements today, is a more comprehensive, honest history. That's what needs to be fought against. It's the enemy because a more truthful, inclusive history is by its very nature critical of certain elements of the nation's past. And those who criticize a nation's past, especially the parts that others want to exalt or praise, they're often seen by their opponents as being against the country in some way. So with my historical example, those who dared to suggest that Germany had actually lost the war militarily, they were seen as being unpatriotic, not loyal to the fatherland. Today, in populist movements, and indeed in authoritarian regimes, to suggest that the country, didn't do everything right, is deemed to be unpatriotic and disloyal. Clearly, authoritarian regimes are not fond of acknowledging their past mistakes and errors, let alone are they fond of admitting their crimes or the atrocities that they created. And there's two reasons for that. The first is very simple. They don't see past actions as having been criminal or erroneous. They weren't wrong. The second part, though, of why that occurs is that in their minds, admitting those errors is evidence of insufficient nationalist feeling. So again, we go back to that it's deemed to be unpatriotic or somehow disloyal to admit that there was ever a mistake in that country's, history. But I guess what frightens me about the current climate is that these kinds of accusations are not unique to dictatorships, past and present. In democracies around the globe today, those who highlight past wrongs in a nation's past, those who call for greater social inclusion in telling the story of what came before, those who really are advocates of more multifaceted narratives about the past, they are regularly accused by their opponents of being treacherous and disloyal to the state. So again, this is a phenomenon that we see, we'd like to think it only happens elsewhere or in other periods in history, but we see it happening again and again. And such name-calling, obviously, makes memory politics especially charged, and it shuts down any fruitful dialogue between the various positions. So rather than memory politics leading to greater social inclusion, as we might hope it would, instead we simply just have increasing polarization. We call it memory politics because remembering the past is being used for other political goals. So people who engage in these debates are mobilizing history for other political aspirations. They're not just debating these things for the sake of debate. They have other political goals and aspirations. But I'm wondering if maybe we should, coin another term. In addition to memory politics, I wonder if we could speak of something like amnesia politics, because there is also such sharp disagreement about what is or should be, according to some, what is or what should be ignored and forgotten. So it's the forgetting part that actually leads me back to how I want to respond to that question about why there is renewed interest in 20th century history as a political tool. My short answer to that question is really, we forget. Because we, or at least those of us who are not investigating this period for a living, or those of us who didn't live through it the first time, firsthand, we forget the actual devastating, traumatic consequences of the total erosion of democratic norms. We therefore, because we forget, or never knew, that's another issue, we don't take seriously enough the warnings about where anti-Semitism and racism and transphobia and homophobia and other prejudices, where they can lead if they are left unchecked, or indeed if they are, actively fueled, as we see happen currently. So with an ever dwindling number of survivors and veterans and eyewitnesses still with us, we have fewer and fewer people who can actually remind us of what, through their own lived experience, fewer people who can remind us what fascism, dictatorship, and extremist politics really mean. And taken to their logical conclusion, they mean war. And those consequences would ultimately be negative for all, even those who now blithely advocate their return. The fans of fascist political systems and authoritarian leaders are particularly amnesiac in this regard. They are particularly forgetful. But I want to say that being forgetful about who the real Nazis were and what they actually did actually affects both sides, or multiple sides in the memory wars. It's not just those who call for a return to, a strong man or some of the other motifs of fascism. We also see various sides using epithets like Nazi or fascist in incorrect ways. So those epithets are frequently invoked in memory politics, but they are also regularly misused. So for example, mask mandates are not exactly like what Adolf Hitler did in Nazi Germany, despite the parallels that some might make. But at the same time, I think it's equally important to recognize that objecting to the removal of a statue also does not automatically make one a fascist. Not suggesting the two can't go hand in hand, but there is not an automatic equation of fascist beliefs if someone objects to a particular statue. So again, it's using those terms as they are meant to be used. Clearly, the specter of fascism is a reality today. In certain locations, there are very real parallels between what's occurring now and what occurred in Europe, for example, in the 1930s and 1940s. But to go back to that idea of 20th century history as a political tool, if we want to use it as a political tool, and let's face it, memory activists on all sides seem to want to do it. So it's not just one particular group that is invoking it. It seems widespread utilization and deployment of 20th century history as a political tool. Then again, I come back to this point that we really have to get our facts straight about it. use those epithets correctly. And so, I've been asked some questions today, but I think it's also important to raise a question, which is, what can academics who study these phenomena in the past, what can we do about the misuse of 20th century history? What can we do about the dangers of memory politics in the present? And it becomes very clear to me, as it does to the vast majority of my colleagues, of course, that scholarly enterprise, academic collaboration can only get us so far. We clearly can't just talk to one another. We instead have to engage with the wider community. This is, again, hardly anything that is, new to those of us working in this field, but I think it's a really important point to emphasize that we must get engaged with our wider community. We must speak to the public. We have to talk to the public in forums that are accessible to all. We can speak at schools. We can create resources for teachers. We can offer professional development opportunities for them that enhance their teaching of these subjects for younger grades. We can aim our publications at wider audiences. We can open some of our conferences that occur on these themes to the general public. We can get involved in public history sites, whether they're museums or documentary filmmaking or graphic novels. We can really take seriously those other forms of knowledge output. And those are the sites where our messages have a greater chance of being heard. So the very divisive memory politics today can really lead to feelings of despair. I mean, I get it. I share those moments of despair when we see these accusations flying, when we see this misuse and this of the 20th century, when we see this forgetfulness about where these kinds of phenomena can actually lead. And I definitely share sometimes those feelings of despair, but the types of action that I was just speaking about, I hope can offer some hope for going forward in the future.